Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's
Good vibes.
Yeah, we did something similar in Paris. I think we got better audio this time. So I'm going to sort of introduce this a little bit, just by saying that try to give a little bit of context. And I think I often think about Urbit and blockchains as being highly complementary, and I talk about this a fair amount. And the reason they're complementary is that we're both trying to build the same world and then different pieces of that world. That's how I think of it. And that world is different from the world we live in. And I often go back to this essay by Josh Stark, I believe his name is, who wrote this essay called Atoms, Institutions, and Blockchains. And he talks about the evolution of human institutions. How do people organize things? How do we come to agreement? How do we enforce rules? And this is a fairly widely cited idea that these days most rules, most enforcement of contracts and promises is done by a bunch of guys with guns. And there are some negative externalities from this here and there. And so blockchains are interesting sort of in this deep conceptual way, because instead of relying on guys with guns, you can rely on this sort of economic ballast of a large number of people, just a majority, effectively majority economic vote to maintain the rules, and that's very difficult to break, unlike, say, a human institution, which is fallible in all these different ways. And so blockchains are a way of getting this automatic enforcement of rules, and this is important for anything where you need global consensus, right? Meaning like everyone has to agree on who owns an asset, for example. This is why the Urbit PKI is on a blockchain, so that everyone knows who owns which Urbit address. And when we went to that from the ledger of who owns which Urbit address living in Galen's email, it was a significant improvement. But then Urbit is also trying to build this same kind of world where, and instead of relying exactly on economic ballast, it's really just relying on the sort of neutral fabric of the internet, where it's just difficult to prevent a packet from going across entirely. And it's difficult to prevent people from, having their own computing device that they can run software on, or finding somebody else who can do that with it. So, for Urbit, this is saying, okay, I have a computer, you have a computer, and there's this neutral fabric of internet in between us, and we should just be able to get some packets going back and forth, and I should be able to run whatever software I run on my machine, you should be able to run whatever software you want on your machine, and those should be able to talk to each other, and no one should be able to interdict that. And so this, you see this sort of censorship resistance in Urbit in this like one-to-one, peer-to-peer kind of way, and in blockchains you see it in this global way of like global consensus. And so I've talked about this before. There's there's Urbit is sort of individual, uncensorable, individual autonomy, and then blockchains are for global. But then I was talking to you earlier today, and you mentioned something interesting, that it's actually not just this sort of strict dichotomy between individual, where there's no consensus at all, which is usually how we think about Urbit. It's not just that, or global, that there's actually a spectrum in between. So I thought maybe you'd start there.
Yeah, so, I mean, and maybe kind of from my side, right, why the conversations with Urbit started and was really exciting, because we believe in what we call open web, which is, to the opposite of closed web, or the current web is moving away from centralized institutions, be that guys with guns, or just kind of companies that have huge network effects, which in turn allow them to kind of monetize and monopolize the access to users and data. And this transition needs a blockchain, needs some way to have global consensus, and understand who owns which assets and program that, and be able to kind of create value from that. But at the same time, that's not the only thing it needs, right? It does need private data. It does need applications that don't need the global consensus. And so kind of where the spectrum naturally comes out is in the fact that in many ways, when you are, even when you're transacting with money, you don't need everybody in the world to know immediately that you paid for coffee. Like that's just not like a real thing. And
They have to see the Instagram post, but
yeah. Similarly, you don't need to know, right, if you're shipping logs and you need to record that or sending something on a ship, like nobody needs to know immediately that this has happened, right? You just need to have a way for that eventually to be consistent with everything else in the world. But, and this is where kind of this idea of spectrum comes in, is that you can have applications which are kind of recording local state, which potentially can be, one-to-one, a group, or even anybody who's, participating. And that is eventually settled on kind of global consensus with whatever way possible. And now, kind of with evolution of zero-knowledge proofs, the way to settle actually became even easier. Now, instead of needing for somebody to replay and revalidate all the transactions, you can just show them the proof that the rules were followed, and they can, validate that given the rules that everybody pre-committed before, rules were followed. And so the state is indeed consistent with those rules. And I think that is kind of together with, kind of blockchains and kind of Urbit, like provides us with the machinery now to build this open web vision, right? Where we don't need everything to be immediately consistent. We don't need everything like only lives on my server and nobody ever will able to verify that I'm not like cooking the books. Now we can have, something lives on my server, but I can prove to everyone else that my state is consistent. I can work with everybody else and show them pieces of state, and then we can, eventually finalize that into global consensus. And so I think like as we're starting to think more in that way, first we'll need to continue tuning how blockchains work, and Near's already kind of sharded, system, but like this idea is how to improve that. It's also now more and more about how do we make applications that leverage this architecture, which has data in kind of private data on my server, private data on maybe a group, or a company, or that shares together information. Yeah. And so with that, like how do we rebuild a lot of the pieces right now that everything lives on Google servers, and if Google, for example, tomorrow says let's just shut down
Google would never shut down one of their services.
Yeah, they never shut down any services. Yeah, and so, like everybody's like I like to use Notion because Notion is a startup, and Notion tomorrow, I mean, hopefully not, but can go out of business. And it's funny because half of Web3 uses Notion to store all the information about all their Web3 application. And like, do you guys like realize that tomorrow that all can disappear? And so I think like that's where do you need global consistency on your documentation? Probably not, but you are able to
you at least need replication and you need control.
Exactly. You want to control, you want ownership, you want backups and a way to have resiliency, and so you can serve it from your server while still have replication to the level that you're consider that valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting that it goes back to something that Josh, the director of UF, and I have been discussing a little bit lately, of thinking about Urbit as computing for serious people. Because the current web, it really isn't designed for that, right? TikTok is not really particularly serious, and so one thing that you want to do if you're working on something you care about, right? You want it to be the case that you minimize all the external dependencies, all these external sources of risk. And yeah, like the Notion example is, I think, very apt, where ideally the way something like Notion would work is that I store all my own Notion data on my device, and I have some sort of automated backup to a cloud that I have some kind of control over, and that's all encrypted, and I have the keys to that are ultimately reside in some sort of hardware wallet that I have, right? Or in or maybe in the secure enclave on my phone, or a mix of that and my other 3 devices and a couple of my friends for social recovery or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? But there you have the control stemming from the individual, and you broaden it as needed with social recovery of maybe, and then you can still use the cloud for what it's good for, which is replication and global availability and efficiency. But then you don't have to. The relationship between the individual and the cloud could be very different, where they don't get to pull the plug.
Yeah, you're in control. Yeah,
Yeah.
And either way, you want to be both in kind of control of the data, right? Right now, when we upload to cloud, we upload usually unencrypted data. So,
Yeah.
And if they get for whatever reason, right, they decide to look at it, they can. Yes, usually at rest there is encryption and all the stuff, but that's more of a implementation detail. But there's kind of keys that allow to decrypt data when it's been loaded. And then the other side, as you said, this cloud can go out of business, that cloud. So people who are serious usually store in multiple clouds. And you're like, well, that seems kind of counterintuitive because cloud's supposed to be already replicated data storage, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you store in some replicated data storage that does not have this kind of centralization points as well? But at the same time, you want to have a way to kind of give access control to this, give ability for others to participate, maybe edit, etc. And so you need a model that is actually, the access control itself is something you want globally available and kind of easily mutable with kind of cryptographic identities.
You're saying you want the availability itself to be global.
You want the access control.
Access
the
control.
way, how I want to share it with you, right? I want to share it with just your identity, not deal with how many devices you have and where else you're going to have, social recovery, etc. set up.
Right.
And so I think that's where blockchain kind of comes in back because it's a really good way of managing identities and access control.
Right. Yeah, and inside of Urbit, all the access control that we do is either internal within a single Urbit where we have different applications, and then we're building a user space permissioning system that's sort of like iPhone permissions, right? So this app wants to use your camera, this kind of thing. So it's either that or it's person to person. So it says, is your ship allowed to make this kind of request to me? And that's very nice and easy to write in Urbit because it says, is it this person? No, is this, like when the operating system gives you an event to handle, the operating system has already figured out and cryptographically verified who it is who's sending that to you. Right? And so you just get a number and you say, yeah, okay, for that person's Urbit address as an application developer, and you say, all right, is that number in the set of people who are allowed to do this? Are they in the group? Do they have this role? And we're currently working on a system that we call encrypted remote scry, which is a networking protocol. I don't know if we said we wouldn't talk about networking protocols again, but that's a new network. Well, it's actually using our existing network protocol, but in a new way that allows for encryption. But it's a way to disseminate encrypted data in a very scalable way because it uses Urbit's namespace. Right, so I'm saying I'm publishing a piece of data from my ship, and I'm going to sign that the location, the sort of Urbit version of a URL, that the data at that URL is this. Right, sign that whole thing with the key that's visible on chain, so everybody can tell it's my key. Right. So we use this for data dissemination. It's pretty new, but we're using it for that. And then, so the next step there is to allow that to publish encrypted data through this as well, so I can decide who I send the decryption keys to, so that they can see that.
Yeah, I think this maybe goes kind of to some of the partnership we're working on, which is how do we not just do this for data, but also for applications? How do we bring and have an application kind of discovery happening? And then on the other side, how do we decentralize access to applications that right now are centralized, right?
Yeah.
And so for those who are not familiar with Near, we've launched earlier this year a blockchain operating system, which is designed to decentralize the front ends of applications and allow kind of the front end itself to live on a blockchain and be able to be accessible through any of the so-called gateways. So that anywhere you go, you can access the same applications and they can work with the same data. And it doesn't matter kind of, you go to uniswap.org or near.org or any other website or Urbit server, you should be able to use the same application with the same data that is linked to your account and to the kind of state of this application on the back end. And so Urbit is kind of, with its architecture, is really well suited to be this gateway dissemination platform such that anywhere you go, you can actually start accessing these applications.
Yeah. And I'm excited that you got that working. So now you can use an Urbit as a BOS gateway. And we demoed that in Paris. And
So yeah, for those who don't want to pay Uniswap front ends 15 bips, there's actually a Uniswap front end for, I think, almost all the blockchains from mainnet to all the layer 2s available through the gateway, and you can access it through your Urbit.
Pretty cool. Yeah. And so the next step on that project that we've been talking about a little bit, right, is that ideally not only could you, when you download this front-end component for interacting with Near, ideally that front-end component can also speak to my own Urbit if I have one. Right? And so that's a project that we've just started talking about. But I like that idea because I think Near has a lot of these interesting services that I think would be very nice for Urbit to be able to plug into. So, for example, you have that decentralized GitHub, so it would be very cool to be able to load up a boss component, and then be able to actually interact with this decentralized GitHub, but as my Urbit account, for example, right? And then have my Urbit be storing a repo that I'm working with. Right, so I can pull that up from any of my devices, right?
Yeah, so ideally, linking your Urbit account with Near account, and to the question of like, how do we get all of you to pretty much in this collaboration, right? Ideally, there's a link between your Urbit and Near account. You're able to transact with Near and/or interact with Urbit applications, which are underneath. And so when you go to the gateway that is running from one of the Urbits, you're able to, like the components there, the applications there are able to interact with the kind of back-end code that runs on those Urbits. And this way you can start building applications which are indeed now don't need the global consensus, right, but actually can be something that's local, right, which is, the idea space is huge. And at the same time, you can still rely on the identity, you can still rely on money, you can still rely on kind of all those pieces that are provided there. And you can have, indeed, like with GitHub, discovery of applications, right? One of the questions I was asking is like, well, how do you find applications for Urbit, right? Like, if you're just on Urbit and you don't go to centralized providers, how do you find them? And so this can be a way to do that as well, where you record them on Near, and then you can show them directly inside the gateway on Urbit.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this in general, this idea of using a blockchain sort of pretty lightly, but using it as a means of global broadcast, where it's open entry global broadcast, because I think that's actually a difficult sort of technical problem in general.
It is, yeah. And blockchain, that's why, global consensus solves a really, really difficult problem, which is everybody knows the state at the same time. And so it's good for discovery, it's good for a number of things. It's not good for everything, that's the other part. And so you shouldn't shovel too much into this. Yeah. But it allows to do a lot of interesting kind of augmentations for existing applications as well, where, as you're building your whatever, social app or, kind of a game, you could have this common state that you're using as well in it. And so, again, the idea, how do we bridge these two pieces together such that you can build applications? And even like some of the applications on Near people have been building using this front ends, they wanted to use local state, for example, for chat or for example, we have Jutsu, which is an IDE, and they have a shared mode where like multiple people can edit code at the same time.
You don't want to put every keystroke on chain?
Yeah, you don't store every keystroke on chain. Yeah. So you can have like a local set of, let's say Urbit's connected and like actually exchanging the state and then committing that state when it's ready to the decentralized GitHub afterwards. Yeah. So I think that those are the pieces that kind of like, you can start seeing how all those pieces fit together.
Yeah, I'd actually say that there's a spectrum there too, right? Where you have, blockchain is sort of globally persisted, and Urbit is locally persisted for one user, but probably in the cloud. And then you have browser local storage, but on a disk. And then you have
like
just in memory,
RAM, yeah.
Right, yeah, and so different applications need different pieces of this. And one thing I think about is, there's this idea in computer science of the memory hierarchy, right, where people usually say, okay, you've got your registers in your CPU, and that's where your working state. You got maybe 5 or 10 of them, something like that, and that's just like your working memory. You're adding and subtracting and storing and loading, and then you have layer 1 processor cache, layer 2, layer 3. Each one of those gets, as you go further, they get bigger and slower. Yeah. And then you have RAM, and then you have disk, right? And people usually say and once it's on disk, it's persistent, right? But then in practice, of course,
there's network, there's
the network,
local
there's the
network,
cloud, right? And then I think even a blockchain is even more than the cloud, right? That's persistent in a way that it's incentivized persistence, uncensorable persistence, right? And then I think that I think Urbit's sort of mostly in this like local, personal persistence realm. And blockchains are mostly on the global. But then, even in Urbit, right, there's this application called Turf. That's pretty cool. There's a demo of it. And it's sort of like a decentralized gather town where I can build a little 2D world, put little portals in it to other people's 2D worlds, and we have little avatars we can walk around. I can jump into your world, you can jump into mine. It's pretty fun. And but in order to do that, just like you don't want to put every keystroke on chains, you also don't want to put every character motion into your Urbit, right? And so for that, we actually want to have a WebRTC connection that's established by your Urbit, but that's for real-time, non-persistent. It's not even necessarily guaranteed to have transmission control, right? The unreliable packets, right? But that's what you want for that kind of thing. And so even within an Urbit application, you still want to have this other layer that's not persistent. And I think that's something that we've been exploring a little bit more lately, past 6 months or years, saying, okay, well, Urbit's designed as basically a database, right? It's like one way of thinking about Urbit is you took the operating system, you stuffed it into the database. And so, whenever anything new comes in, it writes it to disk. It should be a write-ahead log the way you guys are implementing. But it's not quite there yet. For those sorts of things where it's really ephemeral data, you really don't want to. You don't want it to be formal, right? So the other way of thinking about this spectrum is like a increasing formality of the data, right? If it's on chain, that's very formal data.
Formality, economic kind of security, as well as kind of the view on this data, right? Is like as a personal view, is it like a group view, is it a global view? Yeah. So there's like a few different parameters, and kind of with any databases, you want your choices and you pick what you need for your application. Yeah. And and then you mix and match different services for your like overall architecture, right?
Yeah, it's like building out the Web3 version of the like AWS product offering.
Exactly.
There's like 80 different services, and you got your CDN, and you got your work queue, and your authentication service, and all this stuff.
Yeah, and that's why we've been focused a lot on kind of in this blockchain operating system like stack, open web stack in general. We've been like, okay, what are the things people need, right? Well, you need like on the consumer user side, you need push notifications, right? You need a way for application developers to connect to their users. Like right now in Web3, somebody connects to your app with a wallet, there's no way you can like reach out to them.
Yeah.
Like there's no way to like push them something and say, hey, your account state changed or there's a new update. And so we worked on that search, right? We have this global swath of data on blockchains and in personal kind of state as well. And there's no way to search that, right? Like you can go to Block Explorer and search for addresses, but that's not the way normal people think, right?
Yeah.
So how do we kind of create search indices for this? And so to your point of like all the services, we've kind of been building some of this like, I call it middleware, but like all of this intermediate set of services as well that can be like Web3 native to provide the user experience that as a user I'm used to when I'm using these platforms. And I think the next interesting thing will be AI as well, and kind of mentioned before, we definitely don't want, kind of similar how we don't want our social graph to live in Facebook and only Facebook is able to tell us what do we do. We don't want the intelligence capabilities, right, which AI now provides, to be living and be defined by centralized players. And so thinking as well on the spectrum now, from this like very centralized, you use an API, you have no idea what's behind it.
Yeah.
OpenAI can be switching model every time, or like for this users we give a shitty model, for this users we give a good model.
Yeah.
Right? Or you have this open source, which is you can have now a spectrum as well, where maybe we have a lot of smaller models running across the network on, let's say, Urbit, and then you can query them through a very clear protocol.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of really how do we push more of this computation on edge and really interact with them. And you kind of still need some global consensus to coordinate that, to know who's running which models, maybe what the experts provide, some payments for that because it may be expensive. So you're kind of starting to also leverage this.
Why do you need to know who's running which models?
Why do
you need to know who's running which models? You're saying that's something you want to log on chain. What's the
you want to, let's say I'm running, I'm, for example, fine-tune my language model to be financial expert, right? And so you want to query it if you want to have some financial advice.
Yeah.
Somebody fine-tuned their model for coding, and so you can ask it. So you need a registry of that, right?
Okay.
You don't want local consensus on that. You want a global,
going back to the discoverability, rating, like global posts, global broadcast.
And you want some rating, reputation, and the best way to measure reputation is how much financial kind of payments people received for it, right? So you can record I've queried it, it's good, I keep querying it, so I'm keep paying for it, or I queried it, it's bad, I'm not using it anymore, so it's not getting the kind of financial reputation. So things like that you can start building out in this. Again, I'm thinking of this spectrum, right, as a new architecture that everybody can use for all of these different use cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, so Native Planet, Urbit company, they just got an LLM running on their hardware. It's not particularly fast at the moment, so they call it Pen Pal. But I'm expecting that these models will get quite a bit easier to run on a home computer over the next year or two. I think they already are a lot easier than they were even a few months ago.
For sure, yeah. There's a lot of open source just work going into this, and probably we'll need some kind of sidecar for GPU compute for Urbit, but
that's what they want to do. They want to. Well, I don't know if we needed a sidecar actually. I think the way I'd like to do it, ideally, is have some way of expressing deterministic floating point. We could have a whole 5-hour discussion just about that. We have internally, and I guess you guys probably have too.
Floating point, somehow the beach of computer science.
Yeah. For those not familiar, if you run floating point code, doing 1.23 times 1.24, depending on which processor you run it on, you might get a different answer.
And that's not according to the same processor. Sometimes it's still different answers.
Even worse, yeah. So for a deterministic system like Urbit, this is very frustrating, right? So we have a software implementation of floating point, which is apparently how you guys do it too.
Yeah.
But to maintain determinism. But ideally, the way this would work, right, is that it really is a pure functional computation, right? Any kind of big matrix multiplication you're doing. So you could have it in a sidecar, but you should just be able to express that in knock, and then jet it with something that goes and runs on GPU even, right? Or our first attempt is just going to jet it with BLAST like NumPy does. Right? So it'll be sort of like you have a little bit of a Hoon API, and it'll feel a lot like writing NumPy code. And then eventually we'd like to write an array language that's maybe an Urbit native array language, or maybe an implementation of an existing one like K or J or something like that. But I feel like the actual array math that goes on in these neural nets is very minimal, actually, right? Like, and I think most of the difficulty, from my understanding, is in setting up the data and training it and figuring out how to tune all that stuff.
I mean, generally, yeah, the complexity is in how to pipe this much computation through as fast as possible, and that's Like at inference time, it's all about like how to pipeline as much as possible, because you still kind of need to do like one step at a time.
Okay.
And so that's where a lot of the bottlenecks are. But you still want to do mad moves as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Mad moves are still non-deterministic on GPUs. And that is, at the end, going to be the biggest problem.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I'd like to see, I'm a little surprised that it's not easier to do this. Right? I'd like to say that, okay, I have some Urbit group, and then maybe we can take Llama or some open source model and train it to be funny. And I think this is a big sort of open space in the market that OpenAI, I think, will never be able to capture. I think they're structurally prevented from ever being funny. Like ChatGPT it would be illegal for it to be funny, or something like this. Maybe not actually illegal, but in practice, I think, they're very concerned with all these ideas of safety.
Yeah.
And so, it can't answer your question without a disclaimer. So I think it would be really nice for to be able to just take an AI and train it with my friends, and feed it some jokes even, right? Inside jokes. It doesn't have to be funny to anybody else, right? But it could just be, like there's sort of personal AI, and I think Owen is going to give the talk after ours, and I think he's going to talk about this. But then there's also this, social AI of like just our
group AI, yeah.
Yeah, and like I can imagine that you do this. Okay, we all start with Llama, and then we share around some patch files for the weights, or
there's a
some way of combining
adaptation.
context.
There's a low-rank adaptation. This is how you do fine-tuning on top of existing base model.
Yeah.
So it's like way smaller amount of weights.
Exactly,
like
right.
Weight additions, yeah. And so you can share.
Yeah, it's not the full 7 gigabytes or whatever they have to, or 70 that you have to shuttle around all the time. So I'm a little surprised that people haven't built this, or maybe they haven't. I haven't seen it.
There's some examples of that, yeah.
I would love to do this with my Urbit, right? I store the actual model in my Urbit, and then all the patches that I have of these fine-tunings.
Yeah.
And then I can share those around, and we can combine them socially. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
sounds like a project for somebody here.
Yeah. If someone wants to write a grant proposal, we'll look at it.
Yeah. But in general, like having kind of AI capabilities on Urbit, right, is an example of like enabling more rich applications on edge, and then being able to share that either with friends or with other people who are accessing your Urbit is, going to actually enable more use cases.
Yeah. All right, so I think I want to ask you something to back up a little bit, because I think you and I have a similar idea here about like what it looks like, for AI to be used well versus used poorly. Do you think you can describe that? Like, what's a bad AI world? Presumably something that's not the open web version of AI.
Yeah.
What's the closed web version of AI? And then what's that? And then what's the open web version?
Yeah, I think to not be super dramatic, but we are approaching this very quickly, which is there is like a less than a handful of companies which control advanced capabilities. They're kind of have all the information about you as individual, and are able to for the reasons which are very much economic. It's not like there's like evil geniuses sitting there. Like for me, for example, I don't think Facebook, is evil company because of people. It's just systematically they will be trying to extract more value out of their users because their users is a product. And so the same thing will be happening here. To generate more revenue, they need to, influence your behavior.
Yeah.
That's what happened with ads on Facebook. This is what's going to be happening with AI as you're going to be kind of using it for your...
Right, and it's either for monetary gain or for political influence, right, or any number of things.
Yeah, which is, at the end, is monetary gain. At the end, economics is driving our behavior, be that like directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
And so the best example you can imagine is a TikTok where instead of watching other creators creating content, it's just a constant stream of things that you for sure will like, because it knows exactly what you like, and it just generates content like this. It's not created by anyone. It's literally just fully generated content for you, and you just spend all your time there while also watching mini insertions of ads through this content as well.
Right, content marketing.
Yeah, content marketing is embedded directly into generated content. Yeah. And like economically, that's the best product because you just have all the advertisers advertising through it. You don't have any costs because for the creators, and so you only have GPU, whatever, inference costs, and it potentially can scale because you can people likes are kind of very similar, so you don't need to generate Anyway, I can build that startup potentially. Now, but that's a very bad world because it literally influences you. It has advertisement models in general is about influence and kind of changing your behavior. And so, and it's designed not for your best benefit, it's designed for the best benefit of advertisers and for this company to make more money.
It's a fundamental conflict of interest.
And so...
Josh talks about this, actually #DibTalks I think may have coined the term, but cognitive security. And Hashtag says that this is paramount for the 21st century. You have to be very careful about what you let into your mind.
Yeah, and in general, advertising model is that. It's about attacking your cognitive capability and degrading it to the level where you are changing your buying patterns.
Yep.
And again, this is
So we don't have too much time left. So what's the flip side?
I mean, the flip side is where, you're in control of your data, you're in control of what you're looking at and of the interactions you're doing. And so you are defining what you want to see and how it should be shaped, right?
Yeah.
And so, these principles of open web, right? You control the assets, you control the data, you control the governance of the platforms as well you're participating in. And so, the AI is yours. It's trained on your kind of cost function, which is, learning, whatever the people want, right? Potentially your economic gain, your mental expansion, your enlightenment, whatever the kind of values you hold. And then in turn, right, it's in competition with everybody else, right? Because your financial gain is, maybe everybody's financial gain, but there's some competition. But now these models are competing with each other in kind of this, global arena, but they are, it's not that some one actor is benefiting from that. And so I think that is facilitating that competition, creating this arena, right? That's what the spectrum from blockchain to Urbit is providing. And at the same time, providing you with personal data that belongs to you, and which means that when you go to use applications come to you. It's not that you go to application and all data lives there. Application code comes to you, be it your Urbit, your browser, and
I run my little piece
and your data loads into it, right?
Yeah.
And so that architecture is very different generally from how we do this. And so the model comes to you and you apply your fine tunings on top of it. And so that's what we've been facilitating, and that's what I think this space really needs to continue showcasing to people, is that you can do it and you can actually get a better result. Individuals can get better results out of it. And so I'm excited of the progress we've made as a space, but I think we still have a ton of work to do. But the economic opportunity for each individual is opened up, because instead of value being captured by, again, one or a few companies, which then influence everybody else.
Yeah.
It's now you individually have the control, and you choosing what, like if you want to watch ads all day and maybe you're getting paid for that, great, like that's your choice. If you don't want to do this and you have like other better things to do with your life, you have that choice, right? So at the end, it's like giving the choice to people and kind of removing this leverage that right now companies have on us.
Yeah, well, thank you. This is exactly what I wanted to hear. So I mean, that could have been a pitch for Urbit, right? So yeah, I'm very glad to hear that this is how you're thinking about it and this is what you're working on. So thanks for coming here.
Thank you.